briefing and discussion of scenarios that eliminate or reduce the use of coal. And I will say that it is now 3:35. A little bit after 4, you're going to start to lose quorum. So we'll see how far we can get through this. 4 was our original stop time schedule.
Good afternoon. My name is Khalil Shalabi. I'm the Vice President of Market Operations and Resource Planning at Austin Energy. And we're here to present some of the scenarios that we ran to look at the possibility of retiring the FPP plant. So first, I'd like to go over the current strategy that we have. This is what we're comparing the analysis to, and this is what is in the current generation plan until it gets amended in a few months. So in the current strategy, we have Fayette ramped down at 2020 to meet our climate protection CO2 goal. As a reminder, that's 20% below our 2005 emissions. We also have us meeting all our renewable goals, 35% renewable power, of which 200 megawatts is solar. We have a 200 megawatt expansion at Sand Hill, that's a gas plant. And we also buy from the market to make up any shortfall. As far as the scenarios, we considered 3 different scenarios to eliminate Fayette from our portfolio. And we also considered 2 replacement options. So the 3 different elimination options are: 1, to retire the plant completely, and that's just our share of the plant; to sell the plant, or to reduce its output to its minimum operating level, which is 160 megawatts. I know there were some comments made about us taking control of one of the units and effectuating one of these strategies. Number 1 does actually assume that, so it takes that into account. As far as replacement options, the first option we have is just eliminating Fayette and then buying from the market for our needs. The second one is to develop an 800 megawatt combined cycle plant. That's right now envisioned in our generation plant, and depending on the economics, we may or may not recommend that in the generation plant in a few months. We did actually analyze multiple scenarios, about 50 scenarios, including 100% renewable replacement option. We just chose to show these 2 here. The renewable options did turn out to be economically more expensive than any of these 2 options. So the first thing we want to show is the net change in carbon that would happen if we were to do any of these options. So this graph is basically the reduction in carbon in the year 2020. A reminder, that's the year we ramped down Fayette to meet our climate protection goals, depending on the strategy from left to right. The blue bars are the net reduction in carbon in the market. And that's really what you want to focus on, because that's really what happens as far as CO2 reduction. The gray bar is more of an accounting measure of what Austin Energy generates as far as CO2 from the plants that we own. So it's really just kind of an accounting measure. If we were to go from left to right, if we were, for example, to retire the plant and either buy from the market or build an 800 megawatt plant, it doesn't matter, because we assume that the way the market's working right now, any reduction in Fayette's generation would be compensated for by natural gas plants either in the market or from AE's portfolio. So in that case, you would reduce carbon by, in the year 2020, by 1,500,000 tons net. There's different scenarios there. If we go to the max ramp down to 160, since Fayette is still operating at that point at 160 megawatts, the net reduction is not as good. And if you go to the sell option, what happens is actually in the market, CO2 rises in the market because it's assumed that if you were to sell the plant, that the new owner would dispatch the plant economically, not like it would be in our custody where we would dispatch it environmentally to meet our goals. So the net effect would be an increase in CO2 if we were to sell the plant. I'll just stop here and see, are there any questions, because this is an important slide.
Apparently not.
Okay, so what did we do as far as scenario analysis? So we ran our models. We have a market model, and we also have a financial model to see the net effect from an accounting standpoint on our books for all these scenarios that we've been showing in the previous slides. This next bullet is very important and really the crux of the whole analysis. Oftentimes, when we talk about retiring plants and building plants, we focus on the replacement. So what's the best replacement to replace an asset? And really, when you're looking out in the long term, that's the best way to look at things. But when we do this analysis, what we find that the analysis is purely driven by the costs of retiring, selling, or ramping down this plant. And I'll explain further as we go into other slides. But please keep that in the back of your minds, that this analysis, we'll find the results are purely driven by the retirement of the plant itself, not by the replacement. The analysis is conservative. There are several costs and risks that we didn't even consider. So what we're going to show you are the minimum costs or the minimum rate increases required to effectuate this transaction. There are other costs like negotiating with the LCRA that we're not included in this analysis. Also, as I mentioned previously, we did run other scenarios, including 100% replacement with renewables, and we found those to be higher than the costs that we show here. So you can look at this as being conservative from a financial standpoint. Here's some impacts. So what happens? When we go to sell, retire, or ramp down the plant, from an accounting standpoint, we're impairing an economic asset. Once that happens, we have to immediately defease the debt on the plant. The combined principal and interest payment we would have to make in 2017, if any of these strategies were effectuated, is $260 million. And also, we would incur that book loss, the value of the plant, on our income statement, right there on that year. All the cases would leave us with a cash position well below our forecast of $334 million in 2017. That's where we forecast our cash balance to be right now if we weren't to do any sort of retirement. And that's 95 days cash on hand. Just as a measure of comparison, in order for us to maintain our debt rating, we need 150 days cash on hand. There are other impacts that we show. For example, we would have lost revenue in our PSA. Although Fayette is a large carbon emitter, it is one of our cheapest plants, and therefore replacing it with another asset would result in higher prices in our pass-through in our PSA. We would need large rate increases in order to restore our cash reserves, and our prediction is that both affordability goals, both the 2% and being in the lower half of utilities in Texas, would be unmet.
Mayor, question?
Yes.
Question, go ahead.
I understand why sale of the plant or retirement of the plant would require us to defease the $260 million in debt. I don't understand why a minimum output strategy or any kind of a ramping down would require immediate defeasance.
Right. Not any sort of ramp down, like the ramp down that we do in 2020 would not require us to defease the debt. But from an accounting standpoint, if we were to reduce it to its minimum output, we would consider it impaired at that point. We wouldn't be receiving the revenue required to pay off the bonds. So at that point, we would impair the asset.
I see the point. Could you compare the ramp down that you're envisioning, you're simulating here, with the ramp down that we are considering that's in their generation plan starting in 2020?
2020, it's about a 30% ramp down.
And what's this?
This would bring it down to about 20% of its value, so 80% ramp down.
Okay. Did you or could you consider just moving up the schedule for that ramp down starting in 2020, starting it in 2016 or 2017 instead of in 2020?
We could consider that. We could analyze that, sure.
That would be much less of a ramp down, much less of a price impact or a rate impact. Of course, it would have a a lower effect on
Right.
carbon emissions.
It would have a rate impact. We could analyze it and see if we could still meet our affordability goals. The rate impact really would come from the fact that we wouldn't have as much revenues as we would have otherwise.
We'd still have to make up the power someplace else, either in the market
Which is more
or-
expensive,
yeah.
correct.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
But we can look at that and see if we meet our affordability goals with an earlier ramp down.
Okay.
Just looking at where we were. Okay. So next slide is really the numbers. The bars, both orange and blue, show you what the cash balance would be under various strategies that we have mentioned: sell, ramp down, retire, whether you place with market or the 800 megawatt plant that you would build. The orange bar is what we're calling our recommendation or current strategy. We do have a recommendation for a retirement date later on in the presentation, and that's why we call that right now the AE recommendation. So that's something new that we are proposing to the group as far as our planning is concerned. But as you can see, and just to explain the chart a little further, on the left-hand side is the numbers for the cash balance. On the right-hand side is the amount of rate increases, and those little black squares are the amount of rate increases that would be required to restore our cash balance back to the orange bar. So it's not both. You don't need both the rate increase and result in that lower cash balance. That's the rate increase that would bring that blue bar back to the orange bar. Okay. Any questions on that?
If you could remind us of the status of that orange bar relative to our financial policies.
Okay. The next slide actually it details that. So
I guess you're about to do that.
Good segue. Okay, so we just wanted to show, I think this is important, just to show kind of where we are and why this is really a hard financial trip for us to retire FPP. This is right now, and we're working on a new forecast, but this is our last year's forecast. We're considering our forecast until we produce a new one in a few weeks of our cash balances. The bars from left to right show different cash reserves that we have: total operating funds, strategic reserve fund, and repair and replacement fund. And those rise over time really as a result of our rate case that we had in 2012. You do see that the bars go down for a while. That's because the amount of expenditures predicted really are not ameliorated by the amount of revenues that we're going to have really until 2015. We are on the upswing right now. Between 2014 and 2015, we're on the upswing and we are recovering our reserves. To explain the graph further, the lines that you see, the dashed red line is really where you want to be. That's the 150-day cash on hand to maintain our debt rating. That's where we want to be. Our black dash bar is really the target, what we're calling our target for cash reserves. The solid red bar is the minimum per our policy in order to operate the company. And you can see how sort of distressed we are in 2014. We're below our policy at that point. So any of the strategies to retire the plant would make this picture more negative than it is right now. Okay. I mentioned that there were other costs that were not included in the cash balances and rate increases that I showed. So here are some of the costs, and some are risks. They may not necessarily be costs, but they could be risks. There's the costs from negotiating with LCRA for any of these strategies. None of these strategies can be done without negotiating with LCRA. Impairing our asset essentially impairs the total asset, and they would want to be compensated for that. So those costs are not included. There are regulatory and market risks that are involved. ERCOT would have to approve the unit retirement. We don't see a problem with that, but that is something you have to work through. There would be prudency reviews, especially for ratepayers outside the city, that may come about because you're retiring this plant early. Also, if you were to ramp down to its minimum value, that could be viewed as market withholding, and it's something that we would have to work with ERCOT on ahead of time before we were to effectuate that strategy. Another cost or revenue that we didn't include is a subsidy on the bonds that we partially used to finance the scrubbers for FPP, and we estimate that subsidy to about $30 million a year. So that we didn't include that in the analysis. That could also affect Austin Water Utility, which have the same bonds. They see the rating agencies or the bondholders see the bond as a total package to the city. So any department that holds those bonds would be affected by them. We didn't do any variations in risk as far as market price. This is expected value. We all know gas prices are low. If they were to change, more than likely they would go up. If they were to go up, all those numbers that we showed would be even more negative. So that risk isn't detailed in this presentation. There's also a city charter provision that prohibits the sale of all or any substantial part of AE. This is something that may have to be amended. We might have to go to vote to amend that provision. There's an opportunity cost if we were to do this. There is a way to retire FPP with all the costs that we showed, with all the rate increases, if we wanted to take them on. But, Austin Energy is a small, nimble utility. It's an integrated utility, which we have less and less around. And we can do lots of things, and we do lots of things that make us an extremely progressive utility. And that's what I mean by opportunity costs. Those things could suffer if our rates were to become too high and we couldn't finance these other opportunities. Things like R&D efforts for smart grid, R&D efforts on our distribution system for high penetration of solar, EVs, all that stuff requires work, requires investment in order for us to invest in our system. Continued progress towards our renewable portfolio. We're seeing great prices for wind and even central solar now. However, they are still above market, and as our rates go up, it'll become harder and harder for us to take on anything that is above market. We also maintain and we'd like to expand a cost-effective energy efficiency. We have a chilled water system and our local solar programs. All that I call the opportunity cost. We do work on carbon. We're active with our industry partners when it comes to GHG legislation, greenhouse gas legislation in Washington. And we believe that really that's the path forward when it comes to Austin Energy for reducing carbon on that scale. So our recommendation, for the sake of time, I'll boil this down, but our recommendation is to maintain our current strategy, which includes ramping down Fayette in 2020, but also having a target retirement date at 2025. This is also close to a retirement date LCRA has put out there in their planning documents. So we feel that this gives us, from a planning perspective, for such a large asset that affects our finances in such a large way, it gives us a target to plan for that's out not too far in the future, but we think can be done. So I can entertain any questions at this point.
Any questions? Councilor Morrison.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So I would like to go back to slide number 9. I guess really the crux of things is on slide number 7, showing the sort of the choices that either you raise rates or you suffer from a seriously low cash reserve. So I wanted to just understand a couple of other things on slide number 9. When you talked about the first bullet, potential costs from negotiations with LCRA, and you said that if we impair our asset, that's impairing LCRA's asset too. Could you expand upon that just a little bit?
It's a common facility. There's common facilities for scrubbers, for the output of electricity. So, and it's designed to operate as a plant. It's not designed to operate as individual units. So if we were to take down one of the units, their units are also going to suffer economically, and our presumption is they would want to be compensated for that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's only human. And then if you could expound upon a little bit the sub-bullet about ERCOT approval for unit retirement.
Right.
How big of a barrier is that? What would the process be?
The process there really would be up to ERCOT. It depends on what the market looks like from a reliability standpoint. So there's two measures of reliability that ERCOT looks at. One is called resource adequacy. Do we have enough generation to meet our load in the market? The other one is transmission, right? Is our transmission system stable? So they would take that unit out of the market, and they would look at both these things. Would we meet our resource adequacy? Is there enough generation? If there's not, they might ask us to run it, and they would compensate us for that, even though we want to retire it. It's not forever. There would be a length of time that they would want to do that until some compensating mechanism in the market would happen. Also, if the transmission system in that area were to become unstable, they might ask us to make transmission reinforcements in order to retire that unit.
So we would expect that there are some things we have to mitigate, but they are not in the business of saying, no, you're not allowed to do that.
Correct. They have to allow us to retire units. I mean, it's a market. That's one of the luxuries of a market, I guess. There's bad things and good things, but one of the good things, it does allow us to both build and retire plants.
Okay. And then the recommendation that AE has for us is basically to sort of stick with our guns as we are, but to add, if I understand properly, a new element to our plan, and that is that we would actually have a target date for retiring.
Correct.
And right now we don't have a target date.
Right now we do not have a target date. We assume we just keep running it as long as we can. So we would look to retire it in 2025.
And that makes all the
numbers. We would put this in the new generation plan that would bring forward to you.
Okay, great. And that's really, this is part of the generation plan, obviously. And I wonder, we don't have to talk about this now because I know we're short on time, but I am interested in understanding, that it was raised earlier, the process that's being laid out for the public outreach for the generation plan. And I don't, because it's 4:00, I'm not going to ask about that, but if you could find a way to bring us up to speed on what you're thinking about and make sure we have an opportunity to provide you with feedback. Thank you.
If I can add just one thing to the recommendation. Things change in the market. If carbon legislation were to come about and prices of carbon were high enough, then FPP may become uneconomic to change our plan at that point. But then it's a market mechanism. Everybody's in the same boat, and then we would have to do that, and that's something, rating agencies would understand, something ratepayers would understand. So this is not forever. If things were to change in the market, coal prices were to go up, regulatory rules would make FEP more expensive. If these things change, we would have to change our plan at that point. But as we see the market right now, we can't see really retiring it earlier than 2025.
Councilor Tobo.
I'm going to try to limit my questions just to one because I know we're at our time and my colleagues may have questions as well. We've heard from community members the question, and it's a very good one, of how a city like San Antonio or some of the other cities around the country are able to retire their plants and not face the kind of dramatic rate increases that are forecast in this analysis. And I wonder if you could speak to the debt and the way in which that debt has impacted our ability to retire this.
Right. I mean, I think you bring up the point that makes us different from other utilities that were able to do this. They probably have the cash balances required, and their debt has to be low enough. So that's what would happen in 2025. We would build up a reserve high enough, and the debt would come down low enough. It wouldn't eliminate the debt, but it would come down low enough that we could just do the transaction and not affect rates. So, I don't know what the CPS economic analysis was, but if they were going to do it, either they're willing to take any rate increases or they can do it without rate increases. It's one of the two.
And is a lot of that debt attributable to the scrubber investment that was made?
It's all attributable to the environmental investments that we made in the plant previously.
Thank you.
Mayor,
Councilor Spelman.
to follow up to Councilmember Tova's question, our policy is not that we won't have any rate increases. We followed that policy for 17 years, and we're not going to go there again. But our policy is to keep whatever rate increases we do have to the point where our rates are at or below the median of utilities around Texas. Is that right?
Correct.
Could you put, I think it's on slide 7, either, that's it, either the blue bars, which is a reduction in our reserves to levels below our financial policies and much, much below what it is that the rating agencies are expecting of us, or rate increases as of those black dots. Could you put those black dots in the context of the policy that we've got with respect to affordability?
I guess we could draw a line to the right-hand bar. Those are rate increases, and I'm glad you brought this up. These are rate increases over and above what we already have in our baseline. So we have right now in 2017 a 1.9% rate increase, I believe. 2016, 1.9. So those black dots you would add on to that 1.9. And as you can see, the lowest one is around 5%, and the highest one is around 25%.
So that 5% is not really a 5% increase. It's a 5% increase over and above the assumption we were making, and that would put our rates something like 5% above the median for Texas utilities. Is that accurate?
No.
Okay.
It is a 5% revenue increase overall of the whole utility,
Okay.
based on our current forecast. And then, so as we forecast out now from what we know today, in 2016, we're forecasting we'll need a 1.9% increase to maintain the upward glide slope of meeting all of the financial targets that we've set forth when we do the rates. That can change to the
Sure.
one way or the other a little bit. And then we are forecasting out in 2017, Ann, is that right? 1% or is it 18? I can't recall.
2017, there is 2017 does include almost a 1% increase.
Right, just to maintain that financial forecast.
Okay.
So every year we do our forecast, which we're coming up on now. We'll complete our forecast, that we'll put that in.
If we implemented 1.9% in 16 and another 1% in 17 per our scheduled expectations, that would still allow us to stay at or below the median of utility rates
We believe
in
so.
Texas?
Yes, we believe so.
Okay, well, there's no way to tell for sure, but that's about what you think we are.
That's where we're forecasting.
If we added 3 or 4 or 5% rate increase on top of that, which is, I think, what those black dots are talking about, that's the actual
Correct.
rate increase.
Correct.
That would put us over the median and
Yes.
therefore break the bank on our affordability policy. Is that right?
Right, which puts us to the recommendation of a little bit more time and to achieve our goals in 2025. And that's where the recommendation. So this one is from the Gen Plan and that we currently have.
So let me really shorten it. Any unexpected rate increase in the next few years is going to put us over the median. Is that right?
I would say so,
Okay.
based on what we know today.
Okay.
Councilor Riley.
We're about to embark on an update of our generation plan. And last time we did that, we went through a process of looking at various scenarios and analyzing the rate impacts associated with different combinations of resources in the generation plan. And that entails looking out at the prices that we've been seeing, identifying opportunities for stepping up our portfolio of renewables and other energy sources. And as we look ahead to that conversation that we're going to be having over the next few months, do you see any way that we might be able to identify some earlier date than 2025, 2026, that we might be able to aim for based on a very careful combination of energy sources that we think through as we go through that generation plan update? If we see that there are continuing declines in the prices of solar and wind, and we decide that we're going to step up our investments in those areas, do you see any scenario where we would be able to aim for some sooner replacement of the base load that we're currently getting from Fayette?
I think so. I think the key planning mechanism that I try to instill with our executives at AE is that we need to be flexible and nimble. This market changes fast. It's complicated. And so strategically right now, we're trying to get as much large-scale renewable as we can while the market bears it. There's forecasting assumptions that we just don't know. Our wind tax credit's going to be extended. Our solar tax credit's going to be extended. Is the natural gas market going to be like it is today? I mean, there's a variety of scenarios. So I think the idea with the Gen Plan, and I'm glad we're reviewing it this year, is we will go through that process and try to create as best the generation plan as we have for our consumers, maintaining our financial criteria. But that generation plan, by the time we're done with that this year in 14, we're going to have to look at that again in a couple more years. And so I think we're going to get at what you're talking about, but I think it'll be a iterative process where we continue to go through it and continue to look at it. And I know that our peer group around the country, our peers that are involved in ambitious goals like these, follow a similar process. And I think that, however, some places are different because the legislature is determining it for them. So they're getting legislated rules. And I think that to a large degree, I've found that from AE's perspective that might be helpful, to have those milestones out there to the legislature, because right now we're just reacting to the market about what could happen or not happen, and you can make wrong decisions. You could have said we'd rather have waited on that solar decision for a different time period. But I'm looking forward to the generation plan process, and we've started that right now. And we're starting that process.
But the point is, there is still room for discussion about alternatives.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
That's a part of that process.
Okay.
But maybe it's fair to say that all the variables, and I agree with you, it's a changing market all the time, but mainly the variables have to do with legislation at a higher level than the City of Austin or the LCRA. Is that fair?
Fair to say.
Okay.
Yes.
If there are no more questions, I think we're about to lose our quorum. So I would ask for unanimous consent to postpone items number 4 and 5 until the next meeting. Hearing no objection, we'll consider those postponed. And again, without objection, we are adjourned at 4:10 p.m.